at a later date. And so we want to make that available. Good afternoon and welcome to the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet Grants Management Division Contracts Memorandum of Agreement Process Training Presentation. This training is intended for applicants for and potential subrecipients of federal grant funds from the cabinet and will cover the revised process for officially accepting subawards of funds. This webinar is being recorded in order to be posted as a permanent training resource, and therefore we ask that all questions be held to the end. A copy of the PowerPoint slides will also be posted on the cabinet website and shared via email after this training. A frequently asked questions resource will also be developed that includes responses to the questions received at the end of this presentation, and an example copy of a contract and affidavit will also be made available. My name is Nick Gill, and I am a Justice Program Administrator here at the Grants Management Division. And with me co-presenting and managing the chat and slides is Mel Cowan, the branch manager for the program branch here at GMD. We will do our best at the end of today's session to respond to all of your questions. And if there's a question we do not know the answer to, we will follow up and ensure that that question is answered as part of the FAQ document. So with that preamble, let's get started. Next slide, please. First off, there are some acronyms that you're going to see throughout this presentation and that you will also hear us use. Some of them you're already familiar with and some you might not be. The first is EMARS, and that's our state accounting system, the Enhanced Management Administrative Reporting System. That's its real name, but for your purposes, it's EMARS. It's our state accounting system. GMD stands for the Grants Management Division, the unit here at the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet that supports the grant making processes here at the cabinet. IGX is our electronic grants management system, IntelliGrants 10.0. So most of you are already familiar with that because it's where you submitted your application for funding. The JPSC is the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. KRS stands for Kentucky Revised Statute. MOA stands for Memorandum of Agreement, which we will define momentarily. And then VSS is the vendor self-service website, the vendor self-service system where agencies must go in order to establish an account and receive a vendor number in order to receive payments from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Next slide, please. Kentucky Revised Statute 45A.690 states that a memorandum of agreement is an agreement between the cabinet and any other governmental body, political subdivision, or quasi-governmental entity or entity qualified as nonprofit under 26 USC section 501c3, or a university when the employees of the institution are performing duties that an employee of state government could perform if hired that involve a financial exchange of resources to carry out a government function. Next slide, please. The reason that the statutory definition of memorandum of agreement matters now is because moving forward, all new GMD subawards, all new subawards made by the Grants Management Division will be executed via MOAs in EMARS, in Kentucky's accounting system. The cabinet identified that we were not taking full advantage of all the internal controls we have available to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse of federal grant funds. Making subawards as MOAs and EMARs provides additional oversight of the grant making and payment process. It makes that process less vulnerable to fraud, waste, and abuse, and it improves the cabinet's ability to identify and prevent potential payment issues such as duplicate payments. This change strengthens the cabinet's ability to make and track payments, to gather and sort data related to budgeting of federal awards in order to avoid obligating more funding than is available under a particular federal award, and generally to provide the level of compliance monitoring and oversight required by 2 CFR 200 and the United States Department of Justice. Next slide, please. So in accordance with this change, you will notice some language changes in the way that subgrantees are referenced in your award documents. In the contract, you will find a glossary of terms that describes subrecipients as contractors. That is an intentional change in order to bring our terminology for purposes of the contracting process in line with how the state process references vendors and contractors. The state administering agency of grant funds, us, the Grants Management Division, is referenced as the Commonwealth, and subrecipients are referenced as the contractor. Now, while this is an important language revision for purposes of subawarding funds, it does not change the nature of the relationships between the United States Department of Justice, the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, and the contractor or subrecipient of federal funds. Per 2 CFR 200.1 and the Department of Justice Grants Financial Guide, page 1, for federal purposes, the contractor will still be considered a subrecipient of federal grant funds from the prime recipient, which is us, the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. The recipient-subrecipient relationship per 2 CFR 200.1 and the DOJ Grants Financial Guide is defined by the nature of the relationship itself and the work being done rather than the vehicle or type of document that establishes that relationship. So for federal purposes and for compliance monitoring, contractors continue to be considered subrecipients. Next slide, please. The contract execution process is the real meat of today's training. This slide passes along the steps you need to know in order to accept a subaward by executing a contract with the Kentucky Justice and Public Safety Cabinet. First, JPSC will issue award notification letters to those organizations selected for funding. And then soon after those notification letters go out, GMD will email the contract and related documents to the contractor organization for signature. And those related documents will be covered on the next slide. As soon as possible, the contractor ink signs, scans, and returns the complete document passage to GMD. We, the cabinet, cannot move forward with the contract process until we receive the complete document package from the contractor and it goes through the contract review process in EMARS. In the past, GMD has been able to make payments back to the beginning of the project period, even if award documents were not signed until later in October. This is no longer the case. No expenses incurred before the memorandum of agreement is finalized in EMARS will be eligible for reimbursement. I'm going to repeat that now and several more times before the end of this webinar. No expenses incurred before the MOA is finalized in EMARS will be eligible for reimbursement. So please get your signed contract packages back to us as soon as possible. As soon as we receive that signed contract package, GMD will review it and the cabinet will process that contract and submit it in EMARS. The Finance and Administration Cabinet will then review and finalize the contract in EMARS. This process takes approximately 7 days. So make note that contract packages submitted later than 7 days before the beginning of the project period are not going to be finalized before the beginning of the project period. That's just not a realistic expectation at all. And finally, as soon as the contract is finalized in EMARS, the Grants Management Division will share a copy of the fully executed contract with the contractor. Next slide, please. Now we want to talk about those required documentation pieces. For entities that are not nonprofits, your requirements are simple. You print the memorandum of agreement, sign it, scan it, and email it back to the Grants Management Division. You can make a copy for your own records and then mail the signed original to the cabinet. Like I said earlier, we will provide a copy of the fully executed contract for your records once it is finalized by the Finance and Administration Cabinet in EMARS, but we need that ink signed copy mailed to us for our records. For 501c3 nonprofits, there are 2 additional pieces of required documentation. Your IRS 501c3 designation letter should already have been attached to your grant application in IGX, so the cabinet should already have that documentation on file. However, nonprofits are also required to submit an affidavit for bidders, offerers, and contractors. Next slide, please. This affidavit must be signed and notarized, and it should be signed as close as possible to the date that the contract itself is signed, because the affidavit is only effective for 1 year from its date of execution. Again, the affidavit must be signed and notarized. Affidavits without proper notarization will not be accepted and will result in contract rejection. Next slide, please. Let's talk about required signatures. All documents must be hand signed, ink signed. Electronic signatures will not be accepted regardless of the type or format of electronic signature. If an electronically signed contract or affidavit is submitted, the contractor will be contacted and told to submit ink signed documentation. This is a non-negotiable point. Documents may only be signed by the authorized official listed on the contact information page for the grant in IGX or their legally authorized designee. In order for a designee signature to be accepted, a valid designee letter must either be on file in IGX attached to that contact information page, or else submitted with the contract package with the rest of those documents, the signed contract and the affidavit if that is required for your organization. Next slide, please.
I just want to add one quick thing. Nick, that's a great background on this. And with the signatures, I think we kind of anticipated some questions about whether or not something like DocuSign or signing within Adobe. At this point, just because this is going to be the first time for all of us, I mean, you know, GMD and you as the subrecipient organizations, We don't want to leave anything to chance with any delays in UMARs. Excuse me. And so knowing that these ink signatures will be accepted is going to be our best chance of not having any delays in the project period start date. And as Nick said, that would impact the eligibility for expenses to be reimbursed. Certainly, as we all kind of go through this transition together, we want to look into some electronic signature options that may be available that the finance cabinet would in fact recognize. But again, for this first transition, we don't want to leave anything to chance. We want you to be able to be reimbursed and to get the ground or to get those projects off the ground from day one. Here you go, Nick.
All right, thank you, Mel. So for submission purposes, you should ink, sign, and submit all your memorandum of agreement documentation to the Grants Management Division as soon as possible and no later than the specified deadline. No expenses incurred before the MOA is finalized in EMARS will be eligible for reimbursement. So please get those signed contract packages back to us as soon as possible. You'll scan and submit your documents electronically via email to the designated GMD point of contact for contract processing. That's your first step. You'll email them to us, and that will allow us to begin to submit in EMARS and get that process moving. And then for our final records, you will also mail the actual paper copies to us as well. Next slide, please. You must mail the hard copy of the signed MOA. All subrecipients must mail the hard copy of their signed MOA. And 501c3 folks, you have to mail the signed and notarized copy of your affidavit to the Grants Management Division, and you may retain a copy on site for your records. The ink signed electronic package emailed to the cabinet is sufficient for the EMARS contract submission and review process to begin, but the ink signed hard copies should also be mailed to us for our permanent records. And please address hard copies, as you can see on the screen, to the Justice and Public Safety Cabinet, Grants Management Division at 125 Holmes Street, Frankfort, Kentucky, 40601-8301. I've probably covered this enough. Next slide, please. But I'm going to say it at least one more time. You must submit all required documentation no later than the specified deadline, because no expenses incurred before the MOA is finalized in EMARS will be eligible for reimbursement. You will
Also, sorry, Nick, just, one thing I'm thinking about submissions too, if I can jump in, is, submitting those documents in addition to having them submitted on time. You want to be very careful that what you send is legible. And so, I think just planning ahead and being ready for that, making sure that your scanner is working or some sort of like PDF. Because if we get something that is, like, let's say like a picture taken, finance cabinet could reject that. And so we, again, don't want that to be a barrier to getting these projects off the ground. Try to use a scanner. Try to make sure that the pages, that your submission is complete. We need more than just the contract signature page. We need the full package. We need to be able to see it. And anybody that we send this to, specifically finance cabinet, they also need to be able to see it and say, yes, this is the contract. Okay, go ahead, Nick.
No problem. That's really good information. Like it says, the Finance and Administration Cabinet requires a minimum of 7 days to finalize the MOA in EMARS. So keep that in mind regarding the time that it will take to get your agreement finalized. Next slide, please. historically, the budget modification process has been completed before the cabinet pushed award documents to subrecipients in the system. In order to smooth out this process and ensure we have absolutely the most amount of time available for the contract finalization process, the budget modification process in IGX will run concurrently with the MOA signing phase. So you will receive your contract email probably while your subaward is still in budget modifications required status in IGX. And those budget modifications must be completed prior to the start date of the contract.
So we know it's going to be a busy month with the contracts, and I can share with you that from our standpoint, we are strategizing, planning ahead, and doing everything that we can do to work ahead. So I won't get too much into detail because it's not that interesting. But as far as like contract tracking and like our processes and what documentation that we can go ahead and be pulling together, we're already working on that. So that we're trying to streamline this process as much as possible. But we do recognize that, going through this transition the first time, we'll have to just really work together and follow all the instructions that we've been given from Finance Cabinet to make sure that that we get the right start dates. You ready for the next slide?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So let's summarize our key points. All contract documentation needs to be ink signed and submitted via email to the Grants Management Division by the specified deadline. Documents must be hand signed, ink signed. No electronic signatures will be accepted. Documents may only be signed by the authorized official or their legally authorized designee. The affidavit for bidders, offerers, and contracts, that piece that's only required for the 501c3 nonprofit contractors, must be notarized as well as signed. And once again, no expenses incurred before the finalization of the Memorandum of Agreement in EMARS will be eligible for reimbursement. At this time, we want to go ahead and end the recording so that you can feel free to ask whatever questions you have, and we will do our best to answer them. But you might not want, your question to be attached to the final recording of this webinar. So we're going to go ahead and end the recording now.